Welcome. Good afternoon. We'll get started with our meeting here. Thanks, Zane. Yeah. Get started with our June 26th meeting of the MAPS3 Streetcar Subcommittee. I have a lot of attendance today. I assume to check out my new tie. Thank you for that. We have a quorum, so we can begin our official business. So, the first item that we have is to review our minutes from last time, April 24. We took May off. So I'll pause, give a few moments to re-review those minutes and entertain a motion to approve.
I move that we approve the minutes.
Second. Moved and seconded to approve it. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. So approve the minutes from last month. We have a deceptively short agenda. Really just one item besides discussion. But it's a big topic, obviously. So we have different folks from Jacobs and related consultants to walk us through the progress of the route analysis. So without further ado, without a drum roll, Lee, if you want to kick us off?
Thanks everybody for making it out. What we're going to run through with you today is our route evaluation process. We're going to show you our initial concept routes. And we're going to discuss some of the connections to Midtown, the MAPS3 Park, and the Intermodal Hub. As many of you know, the project's broken into two phases. Phase one is $104 million, where $9.7 million of that, yeah, $9.7 million of that 104 is set aside for the Intermodal Hub, and phase one is scheduled to be open in 2017. Phase two scheduled to be open in 2021, and it has a budget of $24.7 million. Now, kind of the process we went through, as many of you know, we've met with the various subcommittees and the parks and convention center consultants. We gathered input from stakeholder groups, city staff, COPTA, OCURA, and we also gathered current and projected data for downtown, which includes housing.
Sorry, excuse me, is there a copy of the presentation?
We'll give that to you in a minute.
Okay.
But the data we gathered includes housing, employment, and future development. And then we developed the evaluation criteria that all of y'all have seen and evaluated about 8 routes. Now, like I said, we evaluated 8 routes, and we are presenting 4 concepts that kind of have really risen to the top. And what we're looking for is your input on the concepts, and not necessarily a vote for one or the other. And the final route recommendation could be a modified version of a particular route or a combination of the routes. So keep that in mind as you're looking at that, and when we come back for discussion, that's kind of the input we're looking for.
David, I got a question. As we evaluate the routes, is there going to be a proposal made that will come to the subcommittee before it goes to the advisory board and the city council first, or is it just whatever happens?
The presentation you're seeing now is just for this subcommittee.
Right.
And we will continue. There's still some process after this.
Okay.
So
we'll have a chance to make a recommendation for one of the or a combination of the routes before it goes to the advisory board?
Yes.
Okay.
And if I could suggest, if you could move down a little bit where like maybe right behind Mark or so that some people back here seem to be having some trouble hearing.
So through the process of reaching out and reviewing with the different stakeholders and the Fresh Eyes workshop, we refined our evaluation measures that we use to evaluate the corridors. Now, this is the list of the measures, and under each measure we had several attributes which we scored, evaluated and scored, and they rolled up into an overall score for each measure. So serving key destinations was such items as, are we connecting to employment centers? Are we connecting to the MAPS projects, existing and proposed? Integrating with a transportation network, are we connecting to the transit center? How well are we connecting to the hub? There's also an element of, are we does the alignment on a candidate street, is it compatible with other modes, specifically bicycles? Maximizing economic development potential. A lot of these corridors, a lot of these alignments are the same because it's really, or very similar, I should say, because it's, you know, on a macro scale, it is the same corridor. Are we optimizing system operations? So we're looking at ridership, kind of at a high level of ridership and how we connect, but also are we keeping in mind, you know, we kept in mind the ability to expand the system into a network. So are we wanted to make sure that a candidate alignment wasn't painting you into a corner and, you know, making it difficult to expand, and making sure that the other lines would be connecting as well. And then there's technical considerations too. So we studied the geometrics of all the tight corners, and we looked at the utility information that we had to date, and as well as we overlaid the candidate routes with the Project 180. And so our, you know, how many blocks would be affected of Project 180 streets. And then we also, I think next slide is the, we developed cost estimates. Now there was a fair amount of detailed analysis or estimate work done for the alternatives analysis. And so we used that so we could have apples to apples and projected for each of the alignments. So a big driver is how long an alignment is. And so that was a fairly easy extrapolation. But we also had utility information. And so we applied some, you know, our professional judgment on that as we developed the cost projections. But really, you know, we're here to help you manage whatever that first project is, to be within that phase 1 budget and to maximize the amount of budget that we can carry forward potentially into a phase 2 alignment. Next. So, you know, generally, as Lee mentioned, you know, each of these candidate corridors or candidate alignments are very similar because, you know, macro scale, they are the same corridor. You know, serving Midtown to Bricktown was our general goals for a phase 1 alignment. And whether or not we could touch the park, we tried really hard, and there you'll see some of the, there's a slide on the different nuances with connecting to the park, and, you know, the question of is that important to do for a first phase, or can we do that on a second phase? And it's really, you know, we're looking at the best return on your investment when it comes to economic development and you know, a premium transit service. So the scoring, as Lee mentioned, we evaluated 8 routes, and what you see here are just 6 of the top performers, and down below in our scoring in the peach, those highlight the 4 top performers that we are going to review with you. Rick will step through each of the candidate alignments and review some of the pros and cons and how they weigh against each other. These were all relative comparisons, how one alignment compares to relative to the other 7. As I mentioned, we have scoring for each of the attributes, which rolled up into the associated evaluation measure, which is why you have a decimal point there. So we've averaged the score to create an average overall score. And then what we did in the highlighted green rows for those 2 measures, we, you know, coming from our outreach to you and to other committees and the Fresh Eyes Workshop, you know, the 2 key measures were the economic development potential and serving the key destinations. So we weighted those slightly just to see how they popped, and it really kind of helped discern between the various candidates. So Rick is going to step through the different, the top 4 candidates that we are recommending.
Thank you, Mark.
I need to take just a couple minutes if you, to be up here. If it's a problem for some of you in the back, let me know if you can't hear me, because I need to refer to the map to help. We have brought forward to you 4 options that we would judge are professionally viable and the best ones to meet the criteria. And as we said, the purpose of today is to get all the questions on the table, comments, issues, and other things, sift through that, and then after this meeting come to agreement in the subsequent months as to the alignment that you intend to select. Let me give you the code, because we're also talking not only about phase 1, but we're talking about phase 2, and we're talking about how it fits into a transit system. You've worked a lot longer on that, and believe me, after us going through that process, we have a lot of admiration for all that you've been going through and looking at the transit options and how to develop your transit system here in Oklahoma City. The red line is the phase 1 line. And this one, we've labeled it, we call it reverse LPA, and I'll explain that one to you. The blue dashed lines, there are 2 different blue dashed lines, and those are candidates for a phase 2 expansion, and each one of them are approximately equal to the amount of money that's in the phase 2 budget, $24 million. So it does show that you can build a phase 2 line in segments, build a key segment to begin with, and then the red or almost pink dashed lines are further extensions that could be made, and it's more to test whether in building the first one you've put it in the right place to where it could serve further interests if you decide as a community that that's what you want to do and expanding it. So we had, for instance, the core to shore line, and then this extension down connecting on Walker to the further south to the river in Capitol Hill, the OHC line, and then even a possible future extension on Placid. So all of those fit with what's been prepared for you to evaluate. So the first option, the phase 1 option that's being that's featured here is called the reverse LPA, which is essentially to reverse the direction from how you had the LPA operating. And the primary mover behind that were the duck banks in Robinson and the utility impacts. Now that's a trade-off. That gave, in our judgment, a nod to the reverse LPA over the regular LPA. So the LPA was a well-done piece of work, matching the fundamental component of Midtown to Bricktown. It's quite legible, very straightforward, but we reversed the direction. And it has issues both in terms of how that couplet works, and it has issues in terms of the stop down near the hub. But and this one, of course, the major negative that we found with that in looking at reaching all the destinations was the existing transit hub is not served with this option. Okay. Second option, we call it the hybrid, and the hybrid responded to some suggestions from some people, and we looked at several different options of incorporating Hudson, and we looked at this option and centered on this one. We did a two-way Hudson option, and we looked at that one, and then by turning it at 4th Street, here you tie in with a long-term plan, and then come down the regular route the same as the reverse LPA. So it's there's a very obvious missing piece of this one, which is it doesn't serve Automobile Alley. A very significant aspect of it, and that what we're sharing with you is the same thing you've shared for quite a long time in your work, is it's very hard to establish an alignment that takes care of all of the destinations that you have in mind. And so that's the hybrid, and it's, again, viable, legible, straightforward, making the Midtown to Bricktown connection. It matches all of the possible expansions that you could make in the system. So it was also rated as reasonable and viable. Next one. The Zeta option. We worked at coming up with a name for it. It's Z, but the Zeta sounds like a good option, and that's the name we provided to it. It, on the north side, serves the Broadway corridor and Robinson, and then turns at 4th Street. Well, it comes down, straight down as the reverse LPA on Robinson, into Bricktown, around Bricktown, and then up Hudson to 4th Street, and then back to Broadway. So it takes in the transit center. It provides your Bricktown connection, your Midtown connection, makes a stronger gesture toward the municipal side of the downtown business center, the arts district, and close to Film Row. So though that Zeta option has been judged as feasible, and as you can see, it also fits into the system expansion plans. The final option that we call Zeta Plus, because the drawback of the Zeta was recognizing that there was not direct access to the park and service on the boulevard. Certainly the direct access for a streetcar to the park is judged as very important. There's definitely interest in seeing Phase 2 address that. This one proposes in coming on Reno to turn down to the boulevard and then back up Hudson, down on Robinson, making this jog around this direction and then heading north. That's the primary. That's the only. Well, that's the primary difference between the Zeta option and the Zeta Plus option. We will discuss more thoroughly the issue about Midtown. And there are a number of options available to you about how to most effectively serve Midtown and its potential. And they have cost ramifications and access ramifications, and we can show you. This is the one that we pose as the least expensive option. Because you notice the cost estimate for the Zeta Plus option is $97 to $107 million, and the budget is 94. So we as a team are determined to meet the Phase 1 budget and provide you a project for Phase 1 that makes it possible to allow Phase 2 to proceed on the schedule that you have. And that means trying to make sure that you can build the first project for the $94 million budget that you have. So we will work on that, and that's a challenge to us to help you reduce the scope, basically, and the cost in order to deliver the project within that budget. But the North Midtown, what we call tail track, and I'll describe that in a minute when we get to that slide, is a way to save money to enable the additional track miles that are needed in order to cover the access to the park and service on the boulevard. This is a simple concept route summary that gives you the 4 options that we've recommended, their length, then access to the various attractions. So the downtown transit center is not served by directly by the reverse LPA. but it is served by the others. The intermodal hub is contacted by all four. Midtown Automobile Alley is not served directly by the hybrid. And then the park is 1 block away from 3 of the options, but has direct service through the Zeta Plus option. And then the government and municipal facilities area are served by all but the reverse LPA. So now the Midtown, as we did the economic analysis and found the catalyst sites in the St. Anthony's area, and that the circle became very important, and we actually are recommending that you definitely have the streetcar on 10th Avenue. It has the best economic development potential. And instead of, so we're recommending moving from 11th to 10th from the LPA that was adopted. And what this does is open up questions for you as to which type of service you want to provide in the area. This would be closer to what was in the LPA, only on 11th, but continuing on 10th up to Dewey and around 13th. That's the most expensive option. This one, by going on 10th, it allows you to utilize 11th, and by reversing the direction, you avoid the hook in 11th, where it's harder to have a streetcar move through, not impossible, and then come down Robinson. That's the little loop, as sort of, we use that as our baseline for costs. And then you have a choice of going to what we call a tail track, or a dead end, where the tracks merge and then the train comes back the other direction. That's quite often utilized. It's really not a problem in operations because you have to have recovery time for your vehicle anyway. So a tail track works quite effectively. The biggest problem is that it needs to be out of traffic. So in this location, that will take some design creativity, but we have one of the most creative designers that I know. So Mark has quite a bit of experience with this and actually came up with this idea. And this option of the tail track could fit with any of the options that have been offered to you. This one shows you it on the hybrid, but if you simply double track 10th over to the other ones, you can hook 10th Avenue into any one of the options and it will work. That's the least expensive option. So it's a whole question of judgment of, have you accomplished enough to spur that development that is being planned in St. Anthony's with the tail track, or does some type of loop really think it would be more important in order to encourage that development? And it ought to be driven by what you believe are the best investment you can make for future development in the city. The last item is to discuss the Phase 2 options and give you a little bit of the thought process we went through with looking at Phase 2 and making sure that once you put the tracks down in Phase 1, that we haven't overlooked something about how you actually create a Phase 2 and an extension. 2 options were considered. It's all based upon reaffirmation of your original plan to have the first line connect Midtown to Bricktown and the second line for the Oklahoma Health Center to the park and Court to Shore. And this the same idea of beginning to look at Phase 2 as starting to accomplish that. These are the blue striped lines that we talked about. So the options for Court to Shore are to connect with the existing line, the Phase 1 line here, continuing Robinson south to the boulevard, across and down in front of the park, all the way turning around back on Walker. And the reason for being on Walker and doing this couplet is because the access south would be this direction. So this would work quite effectively with Walker being tracks on in both lanes, in both directions, and a single couplet track here with Walker, and then coming back and connecting here, and then turning at Gaylord, and then continuing on up to eventually taking the 4th Street extension. So that's the core to shore. They're all similar, little modification here, which can be, doesn't have to be. There's really a choice between this, but it could show you could also come all the way to Walker and then back up the park and then straight up Hudson. So this kept it straight from here all the way to the top. So those are just options that you could consider in phase 2. The second options then are the extension of 4th Street and starting toward the Oklahoma Health Center, and that's certainly an option too. That would be tracks in both directions on 4th Street, then making the connection. The challenge with that one, is there isn't enough money to get to the Oklahoma Health Center, so you could build the section through Deep Deuce with the 24 million.
Let me ask you,
Certainly.
On the phase 2 expansion, are the blue lines either or?
Either or.
Okay.
Well, and that's what we've drawn is one segment. This segment here, this combined with this, ends up being an operable segment for you, and would cost probably $24 million.
Okay.
This would also be an operable segment for you and would cost $24 million. So if you were limited to $24 million, it's either or.
But ultimately, the vision would be to have one route that goes core to shore to the health center, and then the phase 1 Bricktown to Midtown. So you have 2 overlapping routes, so you get twice the headways in downtown.
Yeah. And those are that's part of planning the future. And certainly the phase 2 budget enables you to have some planning with regard to it. You can build a segment or build the project in phases, just as you're doing the first line pretty much complete from Midtown to Bricktown. The second line could be built in segments or phases as the financial resources are identified to be able to conduct that. But you do have a phase 2 budget, and what we've tried to do is describe, not to recommend anything to you with regard to the phase 2, but more to determine that what you're doing in phase 1 will work effectively with anything that you decide to do subsequently in phase 2. Okay?
Excuse me?
Yes.
Why did you go on the west side of the park instead of the east side?
Discussions with the parks folks and the core to shore development plan. Kathy's here. We had a direct meeting with them, and I don't know, Kathy, you want to? I can try, and then you can correct me. How's that?
Sounds good.
Because and it was done primarily for development reasons. This segment of land has 2 parcels that are not really in play for future redevelopment. And you have the freeway narrowing it so that the immediate pop of development opportunity here was judged not nearly as great as over here, where you virtually have every single parcel ripe for redevelopment. So with the streetcar going on the west side of the park, and it certainly could run on, the thought about making it a couplet was to extend its reach this direction a little bit, because the park it limits the reach of the streetcar. So a 2-way along the park might be less desirable, and certainly fit in system-wide with this idea of going further south, which is certainly a consideration. But the development potential was not judged as great here as it was over here.
Thank you.
Okay? Is that? Because that was a result of the coordination and meetings we had with them to really to determine what would be an alignment in Court Shore. Okay, so we'll be available for questions.
Well, we're not really ready to discuss this today regarding the maintenance facility, but many of you have seen this graphic before where we've highlighted some preliminary areas for the maintenance facility. We really just wanted to show you how these conceptual routes relate to these preliminary areas. We're still in the initial screening phase, so we'll be narrowing these sites down in the future, but we just really want to show you how these sites relate to the routes that are on the table. Now, one thing we want to do is give you all some homework. We have a few questions that we'd like to propose to you. We could discuss this today. We can also continue discussion next month. But we really want your thoughts on the questions being proposed here. We're going to ask these also at the workshop we're having tomorrow. But take your time to think about these, fill it out. And David would definitely like your answers returned to him by, I think it's July 8th is what I have on there. And we can talk about these today if you have questions, or definitely in July. Just kind of show you our next steps. As many of you know, tomorrow we're having our second Fresh Eyes workshop. The people who were invited to the workshop have been invited to this one. So we'll have that tomorrow afternoon. And July 15th, we do have a public meeting scheduled. We're planning to have an open house from 5:30 to 6, and then the presentation and Q&A will be from 6 to 7:30. And then at the July 24th meeting, we will come back with you and present to you the findings from the Venture Line feasibility study, and also have some additional discussion on the streetcar. So really, we'll just open up the questions. We're all available here.
If you could stand up when you answer a question, that'd be really awesome. I have a question.
When you ask a question, I'm sure we all have questions.
I'll start. On all four routes, on the north part at least, the northbound route and the southbound route cause the traffic to be in the outside lanes. And obviously we've talked about before that we have wide blocks anyways. How much of a detriment is it having to cross both the street and have it that much farther apart instead of traveling north and south in the interior lanes?
Good question.
We're gonna need you to help to repeat the questions.
Oh, okay.
What's that down there?
Thank you, Rick. The question was, how much of a difference does it make if in reversing the directions to put the stops on the opposite side of the streets, making them even further apart on a couplet than if they were on the inside blocks? We're going to get them.
We can just kind of show the section.
Do we know what the actual distance is then between the
Yes.
lines?
Mm-hmm. Well, and the best I can share with you, first of all, it's important that it be signalized, which we're highly confident that it would be or has to be in order to enable that crossing. So the crossing for the pedestrian and the convenience of it is the most important. The way I would try to answer your question is, and this, we have had that experience with this notion of the couplets, and in fact had in the Northwest Portland district of Portland a similar distance that you're talking about here. Close to 700, I think 800 feet different distance between them. Actually quite comparable to the Bricktown. And they are on the outside lanes. But the way I would answer it, and the way I try to think of it, is you've got a customer who wants to ride your system, and that's the priority. And that customer is going to be located somewhere. And they may actually be over here. And so they walk a half a block or a block to this location and then further here. So you end up still with your destinations spreading everybody. Somebody who's located in between may not matter very much. As long as the intersection is a pleasant experience for the individual, I don't believe the intersection's going to make a big difference.
And you don't see any, you think that northwest Portland, downtown Portland is similar to Automobile Alley? I mean, that's a huge street.
No. I said Bricktown, I'm sorry.
Right.
But in the sense of the loop, not in terms of the nature of the area or the
width
traffic
of the road,
attractions, or the, well, I'll take the width of the street and go to the east side where we have a 4-lane major highway. And those are signalized crossing intersections. We have a lot of transfers that occur there. So that one is, we put a lot more attention to because of the obtrusive nature of the street. So it has more to do with the sensitivity and design about how you handle each one of those elements. The walking across the street, if it's a good experience, is really okay. Not a big deal, but Mark, maybe you have something to add.
Well, yeah, it's just the importance of providing that pedestrian connection. So as Rick mentioned, traffic signals will be important, but we haven't done any stop planning, but just for instance, around the Devon Tower, we would want to make sure that there's a pedestrian route that penetrates, to the neighborhoods across, instead of one of the blocks where it's interrupted because of the parking ramps and whatnot. So it's really creating those pedestrian connections is what is most important than walking the extra 50 feet to get to the other side of the block.
But something that's been done with the couplets is to make sure that the stops on each side relate to each other, so that a customer who gets off at one stop would know where the other one was. And I would admit, it's more of a that when Portland went for the couplets, similar reservations were held about whether it was better to have it on a single line, and much easier to identify the line with the double track, and we were quite concerned about that. The results of 12 years is not a lot of complaints about it. So it isn't that it's everybody is rabid about you have to have couplets all the time. It has not really been an issue of any concern to any of the customers who've actually ridden the system. So they figured it out. Now I would predict in Bricktown that you'll have a lot more people choosing to get on in essence the wrong direction to ride the loop, just because it's convenient to them in Bricktown, because that wide separation. And it's a short loop. So some may choose to do that, some may walk across. You'll see different things happening from it, but it's more the experience. Pedestrians will walk places if the experience is a good one. And bad experiences make it seem much longer. So the attention to their relationship with each other, and then the attention to the crossings themselves, and the design of it is far more important.
Okay. I've got two questions. And the first one is, the subcommittee spent 2 years looking at the LPA and coming up with what we thought would be a preferred recommended route. And I, for one, would like, maybe that was one of the 8 that you looked at, but I'd like some kind of explanation as to, we looked at, but we threw it out because, and there was obviously some technical reasons behind that. And the second part of my question is, I believe that the boathouse district is going to grow into one of the biggest attractions in Oklahoma City, and we're not even coming near it as in any of the evaluations, not even the one that we preferred as the subcommittee. So can you address both of those questions?
First question was about the evaluation of the LPA.
Well,
And you're talking about LPA
the preferred recommended
concept
route
one?
is the subcommittee.
Concept one is,
Concept one?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the evaluation of concept one? And the second is, we're not coming anywhere near the boathouse area, and what can we do about that?
Right.
So maybe we should go to a map.
And I apologize if you explain this to the subcommittee at one other meeting.
No, I haven't.
You know.
Good question. Here's your concept one. And we evaluated concept one, and essentially it's the same as the LPA North,
Right.
and then makes these changes here to encounter deep deuce, which is legitimate. It's a developing area, has all the right kind of people as writers, makes a lot of sense. Our evaluation, though, first of all, is there's a lot, we judged there was a lot of economic additional development opportunities here, even proposed projects that would be now distanced from the line. So on the economic development side of it, while you had some makeup here in Deep Deuce, because you've got additional parcels for development here in Deep Deuce, you lose that economic development potential. But if you look at it from a Deep Deuce customer point of view, the Deep Deuce customer, and you appreciate that it's Deep Deuce is stuck in the place of being 2 blocks from everything, from 2 blocks from Bricktown and 2 blocks from downtown. So when a Deep Deuce customer thinks about getting on the streetcar line, they have to travel all the way down here to get to Midtown. And I would predict that 90% of them would make the choice of walking over here and getting on the streetcar.
Okay.
So that the southern half of the demand analysis you have for the simple first line is confused and probably diminished.
Okay.
Because the Deep Deuce customer has good access to the convention center. But following that, they don't have good access. So that configuration, the 4th Street option really represents a good opportunity for Deep Deuce. And its development and its
That's
orientation.
if phase 2,
Right.
if that part of phase 2 is chosen over the phase 2 that would go down by the park.
And then you see what happens with phase 2, that this line starts to disrupt your ability to build the system.
Okay.
Because if you just extend from here, then the OHC customer has a difficult time getting downtown.
Okay, good
Okay?
explanation.
So the cross that you had originally adopted, with the 2 lines, was really the right way to approach your long-term transit needs. Transit tends to be linear, and serving that center point is valuable. And creating those 2 crosses, that was a very great contribution you made in recognizing the 2 phases and trying to go to the 2 lines.
Okay,
Okay?
I'm good with that.
Then the
Boathouse district is right there.
Boathouse district is here.
In the proposed Whitewater part, a little bit further to the east of that, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and essentially, we did some work. It would be easy to provide an extension from the Bricktown line down this direction to a Ford service as it emerges, and as the support for the as the support for the streetcar concept grows in the community and your transit ridership grows, then this kind of connection can be added. And we just didn't add it in the system plan. It's kind of like the film row question, which is very appropriate. An emerging district has a lot going for it, and we'll start developing, and certainly the transit connection is there. And I guess I'd urge you to, this may sound like heresy from me from being the streetcar character, that you integrate better. The study that COPCA has done with the transit system redesign is very valuable to us, because tying in your bus system effectively with your rail system is going to be very important, and there are a lot of opportunities to create other corridors through using your bus system and reinforcing the whole development pattern that's emerging in the downtown, as you've made a great investment. But it would be broader, but that extension to the boathouse simply wasn't added, but it was certainly recognized that one of those would be there too.
Well, I recognize the west side of the park and the development opportunity there from attending one of the other meetings that we had. Which one was it we had? You went, I believe.
Oh, the workshop?
Yeah, the first workshop. And I recognize from the discussions at that one that's a great opportunity for the development, and they're all looking at that, and that's what they would like to see. So I can understand.
Well, it's logical. I mean, that looks like a second tier.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things like Classen and the Health Science Center and 4th Street and.
Yeah, it's just a matter of
An
how
incremental.
successful are we with the phase one to get people excited about wanting to continue the growth of it.
Right.
And as far as a operating line, that would just be an extension of that first line. In fact, with the maintenance facility options you have over here, you might even get an extra block of that line by default through that access to the maintenance facilities.
Okay. All right. Satisfied. Thank you.
I had a question. I wanted to ask, all of these routes, the farthest north they go is 11th Street.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I noticed you had a little add-on loop. To me, I guess, 13th Street allows access to the streetcar, everyone from Mesta Park and from Heritage Hills, and so we lose a huge amount of ridership. And since some of those people live as far north as 21st Street, you know, asking them to walk down to certainly 10th Street and even 11th Street, that's a huge amount of walking. And I'm just wondering why we're emphasizing economic development when it's such a small area anyway. I mean, a lot of 10th is already developed, and you know, the amount of undeveloped area, I think, is already, a lot of it's already owned on 10th Street. So is it strictly financial that we're not going up to 13th Street, since we would serve so many more people doing that?
No question that finances, the question was, is it strictly financial for the reasons of cutting down Midtown? Financial plays a big role, no question about it. But what we were talking about, and understand that we were talking about return on investment in terms of actually development opportunity. If you're making an investment in high quality system like a streetcar, you definitely want to see a development response to it for making that investment. That's a strong recommendation that we would make, because you're investing a lot more in it than simply providing the mobility. You're upgrading the mobility with a better ride, a better environmental ride, and a long-term commitment in your community. So the return on investment and the economic development return has to be judged. We found the vacant parcels around this intersection were really the significant catalyst parcels. So at a minimum, we had to get here. And the reason we recommended going to 10th is because of the number of developments we found being planned along 10th. Okay? So the planned developments were on 10th and not really on 11th, and certainly not on 13th. Now, the exception being the edge, which very valuable. It's this development is exactly the kind of development you want to see happen, and that would be very good to serve it. And so it's very legitimate to talk about doing that loop and serving the edge and potentially other projects like that. And there's a trade-off we all have to face, which is probably in the range of $5 million. And so that to stay within the $94 million budget, it could preclude, for example, direct connection to the park. So our sense is that you don't get to have both in phase one. Okay? So the loop on 13th is certainly possible. That kind of value you ought to mention, because it certainly can be done. It's viable. It's not discounted at all, and certainly with regard to service to the edge, makes lots of sense. But then you've got that budget issue about the $94 million.
Well, you have to consider ridership though too. not just
Absolutely.
Economic development.
Right.
If you're just considering economic development for things that are not there, you're not gonna have the ridership, you're not gonna be very successful off the bat.
You are correct.
You talked about planned development. I mean, if the planned development's already going in, why do we need to put the streetcar there? Shouldn't we put the streetcar where the development has not yet occurred?
Well, let's see. Let's see. If the development's already, the question was if the development's already planned, why would you necessarily put the streetcar there? And the only way I can answer that, try that, is you're building a streetcar in a already built environment. And so sometimes the projects are planned and sometimes they're not. You make all those choices, and what I'm urging you to do is make sure you have development opportunities. You definitely have development opportunities here, but you also already have very committed projects. And let me use Automobile Alley as an example. One that's already had considerable investment and has a good base set to it. We did rate its economic development potential, even though it, quote, is already a committed corridor, that it has good additional economic growth potential. And primarily because it's already established. It has an established branding and identity. So that one has a different economic development opportunity to it. The edge and adjacent projects and serving them, if those are high values to the community, no question the streetcar going close to that will make that project more successful.
And if I'm not mistaken, you were talking about potential projects. Before the edge went in and they found out that we were considering 13th Street, they made the curtain cuts, they changed their plans to accommodate
Correct.
the streetcar being able to turn onto 13th
That's
on
correct.
the south side.
And Debbie, we have a question behind you, and can you say your name and I think address too for the record?
I'm Elaine Schuster, and I'm a lawyer. My office is Heritage offices, 515 Northwest 13th, and we've got great havoc from the transportation and the trucks and the trailers and all of that bring in the prefab concrete parts to go into that four-story building. 13th is not going to have any access from the edge. Their access is on 12th Street and south. So thinking in terms of people coming out of their apartments and out of their condos to get on the streetcar on 13th Street, they won't be there. They'll be down on 11th and 12th or on Classic Drive getting to that, because the 13th Street is a solid wall. The entrance and exit into the edge is all entirely on 12th Street. And there'll be some commercial supposedly on Walker, but those are two-lane streets, so to speak. So your 13th is not going to provide you any transportation or any contact with the edge.
Did everybody hear that?
Maybe not the edge, but it definitely will those neighborhoods that are those first suburban neighborhoods of Oklahoma City that are north.
Well, that's Heritage Hills and
Mestal
totally
Park.
atmosphere, totally different
So
atmosphere.
you can see in the design phase, we're suggesting to the committee and to the city that they evaluate all of these options and make a judgment. And in the design phase, we can give you better cost estimates so that you'll have a better sense of the real trade-off associated with each one. Please understand that this tail track, while less expensive, may end up being very difficult, if not impossible, to really provide in that location. Because it's the centerpiece, it's the circle. And so the simple drawing is very easy to do. The real work of actually having it be acceptable and work may require something else. So that in the design phase, what we would urge is that you look at these different options and work with Midtown to get the best input, and then that can be decided in a design option as you start to narrow down the cost and get to a point of committing to build the final design project.
So let me just reiterate that. We know this is feasible and viable. This is, we haven't designed it and how it integrates with the sidewalks, and there's a couple driveways on either side here that may have to be reconfigured. You know, is that acceptable to?
So is that going to be the case on 10th regardless of which of these three you?
Well, the nature of the tail track option is that we need, because we'll be taking the train in and pulling it out, you need to bring it out of traffic. So it needs to have its own little lane or space. And there's a benefit to that too, though, because the operators also need a place to stop and be able to get out of the vehicles to take a break.
No.
And,
I'm sorry, did somebody else have, Jill, did you have something else?
Not right this moment.
You said that we probably have some questions from people outside of our committee, but I want to kind of remind that we have a process for that. So we'll entertain subcommittee, during this part of the agenda. But just rest assured, everybody else, that we'll have a section in our agenda for people in the audience as well. So don't feel like you're being ignored. And also, if you would, think there's something you can sign your name and put your address on as well. That way they can capture that for our record in the minutes too. Sorry,
Good point. I believe when you were going through the presentation, you said that the trail track eliminated Broadway, but yet on the Zeta Plus, or Automobile Alley, but on the Zeta Plus, okay, these are just separate options that may be possible in addition to like Zeta Plus or
in regards to these configurations couldn't be interchangeable with any of the options. And likewise, if the desire was to extend the system up Classen, it does, if you decide to do one of these, it doesn't mean you can't come in on 13th and connect in at Hudson or Robinson or what have you too.
So, and actually, any one of these options doesn't necessarily exclude you doing something else later, like doing the full loop later or something like that. And so, but that, again, it's not something that's recommended to be decided right now. We think you should have more information on it before it's decided, and you really think hard about the whole Midtown relationship, because you want to have that one work right.
You talked about because these are the reverse with Robinson and Broadway, they're not logical. They're going with the reverse, what do you call it?
The reverse
LPA. Yeah, LPA, where they're all going, Robinson's going south and Broadway's going north. Rick, you have seen plans where you can do that, where that separates them farther, that makes it, as you say, pedestrian friendly, where people would want to utilize it since they're not running close
Together on the same street?
Or
in the core of the block.
With them, so they're not on the inside?
Right.
Inside lane.
Right.
Yes.
What would you do? What kinds of things would you do to make it attractive? I mean,
well,
when I hear that, I think of planting trees and things. Is that what you're talking about, or are you talking about?
It would be making sure that there's a traffic signal or a pedestrian signal for an easy access across the street to that stop, and making sure the stops are oriented so there isn't so there's clear routes into the capture zones, that there isn't any interruptions, such as down in the Devon Tower, there's a couple blocks that are interrupted, and I'm just speculating because we haven't gone through it. So we might not want to center one on, oh gosh, second, I guess. Because you wouldn't be intuitive to get to that other one on the other side. And it would interrupt the access, from this to get to all the way across. So so it's choosing that connecting corridor, the connecting street, or how the people walk to the stop to make sure that's a clear and intuitive way to get to the stops. Wayfinding can be part of the solution, to inform people, where to catch the streetcar. And, I'm not sure of other lighting as well, for nighttime if there's inadequate lighting.
So you have seen it done this way?
Sure. In Portland, our primarily because of the traffic network are all one-way streets, we put the streetcars on a couplet orientation. It's been very
It'd
successful.
still be traveling in the direction of traffic.
Right.
Yeah, well, I know
No,
that.
we understand
In
that.
Seattle, there's half and half on their first line is half and half, or the southern half and first half of the project is on two tracks on one street, and then it splits into a couplet.
And I'll just give you the other one is to make sure that you have the visibility, and the visibility meaning, and it's to quote Kevin Lynch, if you've ever read Urban Pathways by Kevin Lynch, talks about the distance is not nearly as important as being able to see where you're getting, seeing your destination. So being able to see the connection between one stop and the other is more important than which side of the street it's on. And as a pedestrian, having confidence that if you walk that direction, you'll be successful. That's the most important. So the wayfinding that you're talking about, but also the visual capacity, that's where you'd want to evaluate where stops were in relation to each other so that it's very easy for logical for the pedestrian to see where the path is.
So I have a two-part question, and the first part is, you talked a great deal at the last meeting about cost creep.
Yes.
Do we have the money in our budget to do urban design correction beyond the stop and the rails so that we can resolve these issues? Because it seems like in most of your proposals, the approach and the pedestrian experience is very important. And I would agree with that.
Yeah.
And so do we have, I guess, does that depend on the particular route that we choose that affects the budget for urban design? And would Hans Bootzer, our local architect, be the urban designer that would be part of the team developing that urban design? Is that what we're talking about?
He's on our team.
So he would be doing the urban design, essentially.
Well, I mean, it won't be a streetscape project per se. We use what tools that we can, as I mentioned, by putting in, where we place the stops as a large component of it. Making the amenities of the stop is part of the project. Traffic signals are part of the project. If there's inadequate lighting, there is some allowance for lighting, but not full blown for the city. So if there's inadequate lighting on a street, hopefully that's on someone's, log for maintenance improvements if it's a connecting street or so.
So on, I'm a tenant on Broadway. I don't own any property on Broadway. I'm a tenant. I want to make that clear. But are we talking about curbside stops in the northbound reverse LPA scenario? Are we talking about Center Island stops? What are we talking about there?
Well, that's an activity we do during the detailed design, and going through a process what I call reprogramming the street or programming the street to find where is the best alignment for that track, and it could be right side or left side in the case of Broadway. That has certain pros and cons that we certainly wouldn't make any decisions in a vacuum on. How bikes are going to be accommodated on some of the narrower streets. We may have to think bike circulation plan and information signing that are economical solutions for
Okay,
striping.
and another question about Auto Alley. Was double tracking Auto Alley modeled? Was it evaluated? What were the results of that? What were the deficiencies? And I asked that, and I want to stress that, personally, the subcommittee pressed for a couplet to be considered. It wasn't necessarily that we said it had to be a couplet. That's what we saw looking at what other cities were doing. But, Audible Alley is an 80-foot wide street. And where were the opportunities and where were the deficiencies in looking at a double track system versus a couplet on Broadway?
And before you answer that, can I tag in this question because it's about double tracking Broadway? What's so special about Robinson? All of the routes use Robinson.
I mean, why is there no double track at all?
Yeah.
For your solutions.
Okay, so one question at a time. We did. The question is, did we look at double track alignments? And we did, in fact, look at two alignments that were primarily double track. One was double track on Broadway, and another one was a double track on Hudson. Okay, so just and those were two that didn't rise to the top, that weren't included in our summary slide. Primarily to kind of boil it down in simple terms, a two-way Broadway alignment served Bricktown and then came up Broadway. And so a couple drawbacks there is that we weren't penetrating the central business district as well, and also it was the furthest away from the transit center, as well as this district as well for economic potential. So those were the main drawbacks for Broadway. I think cost-wise, it was probably the most economical, actually, because it was the shortest, because we weren't. Well, no, I think it's about the same. On Hudson, we had another alignment that was Sheridan and Reno, and came over to Hudson, and then was double track up to Midtown. And that was really the genesis of the option that you saw as the hybrid, because we looked at that first, and we looked at the other options here, and then we said, well, why don't we try to fit the best of both worlds? And that's how we came to the option known as the hybrid. And the main drawbacks with this option was that it wasn't penetrating the core of the employment and retail center in downtown, and was missing Automobile Alley.
So why not double track Robinson?
Double track Robinson? Well, so the other drawback on Hudson, and it would also, the other drawback on Hudson is because it's a narrower street. There's just two lanes on each direction, and there's parking, and in some cases there's a new bike lane. But there isn't room but primarily it's just two lanes. And so when you put two tracks and two lanes, you then have a choice of how to accommodate bicycles on that street. And one is to completely displace them to other streets and not have any bike access along that street, or to take a lane of parking on one side and try to squeeze in dedicated bike lanes for that street. So that would also be the case for Robinson. But Robinson has some major trigen utility vaults from,
Sheridan North.
Yeah, from Sheridan, just past 4th, I think, or 5th or 6th, yeah. I mean, just major utilities on that northbound lane. There's some on Broadway, too, down in this area. But they are situated in the travel lane as designed by the Project 180 consultants, where we feel it wouldn't be as great of an impact. But the ones on Robinson and that northbound lane are major impacts. We're going to have to find completely new, relocate the whole facility.
Why is that?
Well, we will be right on top of their vaults where they access these lines, and underneath are the chilled lines and the heating lines, which from our discussions with Project 180, they are not encased, they're just direct buried, and so it's primarily those vaults will drive the relocations, but there's also added concerns of leaving water lines underneath the tracks.
Basically the same reason you decided to reverse the.
It was the primary driver doing on the reverse.
Now,
Do you have a dollar cost on that?
I think it was about
It was
5 to 8 million or so, yeah.
Okay, do you have a dollar cost on having to rebuild 3rd, 4th and Broadway? So if you're going to go north on Broadway, you're going to have to substantially rebuild that intersection.
I'm sorry, what's the
intersection at 4th and Broadway.
Well, 3rd
and Broadway if you're going to go north on Broadway.
So what's the trade-off?
with
So if you go south on Broadway, you avoid dealing with that intersection, which is a very messy intersection.
Where it jogs.
Right. You can go over Broadway.
I don't know that everybody knows what we're talking about. There's a triangle, a triangular intersection between 3rd and 4th on Broadway. So going southbound Broadway, you avoid going through the intersection. Going northbound, you've got to make a wide arc to go north.
And that's part of the technical considerations that in that category, we looked at all the geometrics of how turns would happen, and we studied how the streetcar would get through that intersection. It's viable. It works. The only when in the future you make this connection, there will be some curb that has to be realigned on the eastern side of Broadway or Gaylord, whatever that's called.
So you're not planning to rebuild the intersection at 3rd and Broadway? You're just going to get through it somehow?
I mean, there may. Right now, our analysis shows that it looks feasible to get through there. Yeah.
So again, the question: why did double tracking Broadway not score well? I mean, it's been talked about over and over again.
As I mentioned, it's primarily because you're missing this half of the economic development. You're not penetrating the core of the CBD as well, and it's farthest away from the transit center.
Okay.
I don't know how much weight is being given to the transit center, but there's certainly talks underway of revamping our bus system and going to a grid. And were that to happen, the bus transit center might become far less important. And so I just hate to see too much weight given to that when the bus system is definitely in a state of flux. And so I just wonder how much weight's being given to that. Because I mean, we're looking at a system that hopefully we'll be using for 30 years. And, will there be a bus transfer
phase
center
2
in 30 years?
May solve that problem anyways.
Exactly.
It's actually in this category here, which was not weighted, the connection to the transit center. And also this category in terms of ridership, because connecting to that transit center will give you a bump in riders, and neither of these were weighted.
Okay. At least for now, it will give you a bump.
How do you get a bump in riders if you're in a couplet? I mean, and only one part of that couplet serving the transit centre?
Well, because it connects in one direction. That was there. That was affected in our scoring of 1 through 5. If one line directly connects, we gave a score. If 2 lines, inbound and outbound, both directly connect, that got a higher score. If one is 1 block away and one directly connects, that gives, a median score, and if neither connect, then a lower score.
I have 2 questions. One, is it safe to say that legibility of the route would be part of the system operation and score, as far as just the route legibility?
Yeah.
That'd be included in that
system
system operation?
That was in this category.
And then my other question is, what was the economic development methodology? Just empty lots, or
It was, the economic development was based upon, improvement value to land value. So the properties that were in play as development, we tried to identify the amount of properties that were in play. And then, but we also took into consideration, for instance, with Automobile Alley, you don't have as many parcels that are in play, but you have the enhanced, you already have the branded area and the expansion potential of the existing buildings and the expansion of the activity level. So it actually, Broadway received as high a score economic development-wise as Hudson, where you had more property. So one of the factors was the land that we would judge are possible for redevelopment, but also the lands that were available for enhanced economic development, which would be Broadway.
I have a question. This may be an urban myth this committee created, but at one point we thought we couldn't take a streetcar across an at-grade crossing on 10th Street. According to
At-grade
some
railroad crossing? That's
we
not
could.
an urban myth. That's, it would be very difficult to do.
Okay, so that's...
It would essentially, unless you control that right-of-way, I'll caveat that, which I don't think you do. But if you control the operations and can dictate when the freight operations happens, you are more or less at the mercy of the freight operator, and that means someone in Omaha, who's going to give your streetcar clearance, and there may be a freight train a mile away that you're going to have to wait for. I mean, it's.
So your Zeta Plus that shows going across 10th with the railroad?
Zeta Plus, it crosses, it goes actually under the BNSF on 4th.
It's on 4th Street. So, yeah, actually, Tacoma goes across a
little spur line,
a rail line.
And Tampa does too.
It's quite painful. But we actually looked at going across the rail line, but it was a mainline railroad, Union Pacific.
I stand corrected, thank you.
And we built a bridge over the top of it, which was a significant financial commitment.
Can you talk to why we always seem to have one track going in one direction? Why can't we just use one track for both directions?
One track for both directions?
Yeah.
You have to take it out of traffic.
So
lose the whole lane.
So if you were to change your traffic plan so that that lane is exclusive, then you can run one track and run both directions on the track.
But you could get further, surely.
Actually, there are different debates about how much it actually costs. We put in a 1 mile single track section where it was it was in a reserved right of way. It was a temporary arrangement. We did it at the south end of town. The contractor came to us and wanted to build 2 tracks because he thought he could do it for the same amount of money as it cost to do the signal interconnect between the 2 ends. Okay. We told him no because it's a temporary track, and we didn't want anybody to think it was permanent. Okay. So we built it. We did build that. So the single track idea is not done for, in my opinion, should never be done for cost saving purposes, because I don't believe you're going to save money.
Why is that?
Because you have to tie the signals together. You have to have a signal that says to that train, they cannot go because another train is in the track. Okay, you can only go one direction or the other, and that's the Tampa model. And they go from stop to stop, and then they split the tracks and they run single track. Now they don't do the signal intertie because they have the visual aspect. But typically, when you're running a lot of trains with the frequencies of 10 minutes and 15 minutes, you should have signal systems that tell you you cannot enter that track because there's another train coming in the track the other side. So somebody has a priority. The cost of doing that signal intertie comes close, particularly if it's a longer distance, comes close to the cost of building a second track. So you do it for other reasons. Kansas City has considered doing it for the last 3/4 of a mile because it's a temporary solution for them as they work toward the expansion.
Along with that, you have the cost of safeguarding all the driveway crossings and cross-street crossings. And so it becomes, you'll have to intertie them all, so and just public perception too of what's an intuitive way where the train may be coming. So
the Sugar House streetcar in Salt Lake is the best example I've seen of a single track operation. It's under construction. It'll open next spring. They'll learn a lot more about it. But they have set aside the right of way for the second track to be built.
And then the Adventure District line, which we'll present to you next month, that is primarily a single track line, but that's a longer distance, and it's a much cheaper way to build the track with a tie and ballast railroad style versus a paved track system. And and the last component of that, where you would put those tracks, it would either want to be right in the middle of the street, and so that would bar left turns because you wouldn't know if the streetcar is coming from behind you or in front, or you put it on the side, and then you're displacing parking and have driveway issues.
Why, I mean, let's step back a bit. Why are we going to Midtown? Why not the Health Science Center?
Primarily, we used the work done to date, which included the work on the LPA and your concept one as that starting place, and with the vetting and with the workshops and the input, that became our primary objective for the first phase. Recognizing that a second phase or the ultimate build out would connect to the health science.
Would you expect more ridership to the Health Science Center than you would to, say, Midtown and Automobile Alley?
It would be a good generator of riders, I imagine.
Would you expect more ridership than Midtown?
I don't know.
Ridership. See, we can all speculate about what's going to happen. Midtown's very attractive site for this community because it has quite a few properties that are already being planned. And it makes a huge difference, and a commitment to the streetcar at this point, in my opinion, will influence the density that they will build. And if you build a good mixed-use developments, and I put the S on it, if you have quite a few of them, and you've created that really good mixed-use community, you'll have a dramatic increase in your ridership. It will be excellent. So Midtown is well-positioned both with sites, plus a major institutional partner in St. Anthony's, and the recognition of the need, the access to other locations in the city become enormously beneficial to people who would choose to live or work in Midtown. So that access becomes a great value to that property. So I would suggest that it's compact, it's local, and it's already got the bones of some good restaurants and good development approach at St. Anthony's that you have the greatest chance of immediate success with Midtown. And the demonstration there will help enhance the public attitude toward doing this similar kind of strategy with other places like the Health Center and Court Shores.
So at what point do y'all want us to posture a preference out of these options, or what is the timeline with this decision-making process?
Well, we definitely want to come back next month and have, continue the discussion. You saw what we're calling the homework assignment, is that we're really wanting your inputs on the route options. And kind of like what we stated at the beginning, is we're not actually asking you to vote on any particular route, but wanting to look at them holistically and look at the strengths and weaknesses. And again, the final route option could be one of these particular routes, a combination of the routes. but we're just wanting your input on what's important to you regarding, the strengths, the weaknesses. Is it important to serve automobile alleys? Is it important to serve, back to these questions. I should have them memorized. Is it important to serve the park, the transit center, strengths? These are what the input that we're needing to help us make that final decision. And, like I said, we really want to continue that discussion next month. And, here and hopefully in the near future, we'll have a final recommendation. But we really want to see, continue the discussion into next month and give you all time to think about it and come back to us and ask more questions and really look at the preferences.
Let me ask this of Councilman White. Is there a deadline or a perceived deadline that the city council is looking at for a recommendation for a route from us?
I don't believe there is.
August, September,
I don't believe
next
there
year?
is.
Okay.
I don't believe there is. I was in the meeting this morning on the wellness centers, and that kind of tangentially came up. I don't believe there is. I think we want to do it. We want a good product more than we were in a hurry to do it.
Okay.
I don't think there's any.
Thank you.
So a couple more questions. At least in the main presentations you've given here in the handout, you're showing southbound on Walker and then presumably some kind of hook around the roundabout and eastbound on 10th Street. That's different from what you show there. So there, for instance.
Correct.
So how do you propose to handle the roundabout that's in place?
Go back to the Midtown.
That's what I meant.
So the question is, with some of the options, is it just the red button?
Yes. In the middle.
Some of the options show the circulation coming through here. And the way that would happen, we looked at it through our geometric analysis. With the circulation going counterclockwise through Midtown, we would come westbound on 11th, and you would continue to Dewey. And then with Dewey, you would come down at, I guess it would be 10th, and that positions you to be able to jog around that circle, that roundabout.
Has anyone spoken to St. Anthony's about whether there would be any traffic issues with incoming ambulances? I just have seen them on 10th Street, and it's a pretty
Sure.
busy city hospital, and I didn't know if they would have any problem with that.
That's a valid question.
We haven't had any formal discussions today. We are currently wanting to engage in further discussion with all the stakeholders.
So the question is about emergency access to St. Anthony's, and that is typically a process we go through in the early stages of design when we're setting the alignment and establishing what all the traffic circulation will be. I mean, one of the natures of a streetcar is that you're in the street.
Right.
And so, are there concerns of when sirens are blaring, does the streetcar need to stop, or does the streetcar need to get out of the way, or that's part of the process.
I have a few questions that may not be coming up today. When do you expect to have a maintenance facility recommendation?
We're hoping to have the maintenance facility recommendation coincide with the route recommendation.
What about propulsion?
I think that will be determined, later down the road once we get into a design.
Have you considered wireless operation in the way you've been looking at these routes?
We have determined, we do realize that, with any route option that's selected, a on-wire, off-wire system is going to be required. We have taken that into account. One thing that we'll have to look at once we get into design is where those sections will need to be on-wire, where those will need to be off-wire. We do know that when we go under the Reno and Sheridan bridges, those will obviously have to be off-wire, maybe around Devon, the Memorial, those questions. We've heard possibly Automobile Alley may not want wires. So those are further discussions we'll have to have once we get into design of where the on-wire, off-wire sections will need to be. also take into account Project 180. To help minimize that impact of Project 180, off-wire might be a better option.
So Project 180 came, and we've missed that opportunity for integration, and now we have to go off-wire because of Project 180.
Well, with the sections of project that's built on Project 180, we have had discussions with Tetra Tech and SRB, who are doing package 6 and 7 respectively. So we having those discussions. They are working with their design to help accommodate the streetcar on the potential streets that could be affected by these routes.
So at a minimum, it would just be to get, the absolute minimum would be to get underneath the railroad structures.
Now, the copter planning grant, are we getting an update on that today?
Sir, I can give you a quick update.
I mean, I've got these things from last time, so
Yeah.
economic development, land use assessment.
Even on development land use, we've received our initial comments on the draft. We're working on finalizing that report.
When's that due?
We're hoping probably at the end of July, I believe.
Right.
We're gathering some additional, kind of baseline data to.
So will that be available for us to make a more informed decision?
It would be, it probably will not be available in July because the data, Larry, maybe you can help me on that. We're working on getting agreement on the employment data. So that's the employment data that's been the hang up in terms of getting that. The original report used the OCART study, and we're working on getting the right, the acceptable data source for the employment side of things so that we can complete the report for you. So
Right.
that one's, it's pushing us in terms of our ability to get it turned around and finally out to you by the July meeting.
Ridership forecast?
Again, waiting on the same data.
Assessment of health impacts?
The health impacts, that study is in draft. It's currently being reviewed. Same with the livability.
Streetcar system visualizations, will you have those ready for the July 15th public meeting?
They're still working on, the draft. I've seen some preliminary information from them, some preliminary, stills. They're working on the model and making some tweaks here and there, so that's in process.
Do you expect to have that ready for the public meeting?
We may have a portion that could be a preliminary draft concept. Really, the ultimate goal is once we have the final route recommendation, is to have the entire recommended route in the visualization. So
what do you expect to cover at the July 15th public meeting? Essentially this material?
Yes. Pretty much the same. The information you're seeing today, even the questions that we're giving you for the homework, those will be presented at the workshop tomorrow. And I believe we're anticipating handing these questions out as kind of a comment sheet at the public meeting. So what you're seeing today is what we'll be presenting in the next few weeks.
Do you give, I know how much educating and self-educating we've done on this subject. When you have these public meetings, do you give people any background on the fact that, yeah, it'd be great to take the streetcar that way, but, they can't go all around turning and they have a harder time turning this direction. And do you give them any background so that they don't come up with these?
We kind of addressed that. We had that Streetcar 101 public meeting a couple months ago. It kind of gave everybody a refresher of the basics of streetcar and how they operate and what they look like. And we did mention at that meeting that we're going to come back to them in the summer and give them some additional information. So we're kind of building off of that. But we can also, we haven't finalized, basically what you're seeing is definitely going to be presented. If there is a need for some background information, we could definitely do that. But, we feel through Let's Talk Transit, the AA, the public meeting that we had a couple months ago, a lot of that's be presented. But again, there's always that option to refresh that if need be.
I think you have to realize that in Oklahoma City, most people are pretty much transit neophytes. There are people who have never been on public transit in Oklahoma City in their lives. And so I think, one of the things I've noticed at the public meetings is there is kind of a pie in the sky attitude or not a lot of realistic attitude about what's possible. And I think what Debbie's referring to is, we've spent 3.5 years now kind of educating ourselves. And so I think one of the worrisome things for us is, how much weight you give to the public saying, oh, I think this is very important, or even the stakeholders. Do they, how much understanding do they have? So, hopefully it's just a guide, I guess.
That's a good point, but I think just my perception, and it may be because of the demographics of where I'm at, and we have so many people in my area that are from out of town. But I'd say it's about 50-50.
Really?
I think a lot of the feedback I'm getting is that, boy, we should have done this years ago. Let's get going. It's a great idea. I can't wait. But and they understand that. A lot of them have ridden in metropolitan areas that have transit systems like this, at least in the demographics that I'm around and the feedback I'm getting.
Can you say a little bit about the cost estimates and specifically how they compare to Cincinnati and Kansas City, which are essentially the same track miles, and Atlanta, which is slightly shorter, and there's a lot of information coming out of those projects on cost estimates. Could you say anything to that?
They're in the ballpark. I can't speak directly about Cincinnati. I wasn't involved in that project, but I've built 12 of these projects, and they're all, and we carry a lot of that data forward as we develop new costs. In fact, we're now looking at generating some representative detailed cost estimates. But it was, as far as a broader cost per mile, it's in the ballpark. Seattle, I was also I've built 2 lines now in Seattle. They kind of trend on the higher end, whereas in Portland we're on a lower end, and I would say we're about in the middle, if not trending more towards Portland costs.
The political battles that have been fought in Cincinnati are truly depressing and inspiring at the same time, and they've just gone through a very big battle. I think, well, actually today was the final vote. But could you say why Parsons-Brinckerhoff underestimated so much for Cincinnati?
No, I can't.
Okay, well, that's of great concern to me, that we don't make that mistake.
Rick, how are we serving, the intermodal hub that's shown here? Are we just showing lines going on Sheridan and Reno and these various drawings and worrying about the stop, or how we connect to the historic structure later as part of the same sort of urban design discussion that we had earlier in the meeting?
The 2 things. Obviously, the phase 1 development anticipates a stop on each end, and the hope would be that there's that good pedestrian connection that enhances this area for that particular line. Phase 2 then would add this line on Gaylord, and that while it's been put in this direction, and we appreciate the problem with this side of the street. Okay?
Which side of the street? The west side of the street?
Dock side.
Yeah.
Right. So it's certainly one of consideration. So this one goes in the southbound direction, this is the southbound, this one in the northbound direction.
Well, Rick, can I just say, where are we talking about? We're not talking about stops yet, but we're talking about being on Reno and Sheridan.
Yes.
And Project 180 is in design right now. Are we cutting out a lane? How are we creating stops on either end? And you do realize that when we do that, we're still a block away from the front door of the historic structure, because that's a super block, and that's in the middle of the super block. Mm-hmm. My issue with it, and I've said it and I'll say it again, I've said it over and over and over again, as someone who's ridden the Heartland Flyer and come in from Fort Worth, we have people getting off there with luggage. And they do come out with luggage. So they're not just a pedestrian that can walk a block. They're having to drag their stuff with them. So I'm a bit concerned. I like the couplet, in the sense that we're penetrating Bricktown in a greater way. But at the same time, we're not making a very good front door connection to that historic facility.
First of all, let me just say there are very few train stations where I can just walk anywhere with my luggage. I have to walk.
But that's
Luggage.
because they couldn't design it that way. We could design it that way.
Most of them I have to walk a certain distance with luggage. The question that I have is right now, if we were to build this today, the technology that's available to us is the catenaring wire system. And we've had several people that are along the LPA and such express intense opposition to that type of technology. Will the adjacent property owners have any kind of say or opportunity about this if that's the kind of technology that is ultimately used?
It's hard to say. I mean, for something to be completely wireless will have a large system development cost, which probably wouldn't be able to fit in your phase 1 budget, quite frankly. But we do know that a hybrid will be necessary, so parts will have to be on wire and parts will have to be off wire, primarily because of the bridges to enter and leave the grid tech. So what other segments are then deemed wireless? There'll have to be a process to make that decision.
What you're saying, Mark, is that's further along in the design process.
Yeah. Jeff, just as a quick side note, I tried every which way to do your figure 8.
A figure 8 in front of the hub.
In front of the hub. And you appreciate that you change the direction of this.
Yeah,
so
invert.
that you're in. If you're in this lane and you come across here, then you've got different lanes changing in Gaylord, so that we couldn't quite. Well, we ended up by doing the figure 8, we broke up any ability to go straight. So you kind of need both, and that's why we went to this, and recognizing you can do it either way, and it's a matter of a phase 2 design work. But we did try to do the figure 8 that you talked about to get it right in front of the hub, but then it essentially breaks up the loop that you've got for the Bricktown.
The design, go back to that.
It isn't just a switching, okay? You have to actually be in completely different lanes.
But so to provide these connections, it'll be a matter of a proper design. And we are coordinating with the Project 180 folks that are designing Gaylord. They're still working concepts, I believe. So we're in at the right time. There are options. Ideally, we'll accomplish the connections with, if they're on the opposite side of the street, with pedestrian traffic signals, and obviously to keep locate the streetcar stop as close to that connection on Gaylord as possible. If it's on the curb side of the hub, as in the case with the Zeta options, it's really making sure we can be as close as possible. Is it possible to be west of the railroad? We're going to look at that. So you're essentially stopping in the courtyard. The other option, and this happens, and I've got a photo in Seattle where their commuter rail lines are actually below grade, and they, at the end of the platforms, then connect up to the surface streets where there's major bus stops. And so that is certainly possible at the ends. In fact, I think your hub study had one connection from the south end into a parking structure or something over on the southeast corner. It's that kind of a design application that can help provide those direct connections and make it a little more seamless transfer.
Well, I mean, we only have so much money, and we are going to buy that facility, and that's a certainty. And I think anything we can do to make that facility immediately functional is important. And, I'm not seeing why we couldn't go to a center island stop to make those turns. Now, I agree, for legibility's sake, we don't want to make a bunch of inversions, and a figure 8 would do that. But I'm still not convinced that the effectiveness or the effective connection of the hub should be trumped for our desire to do a couplet. I mean, as a subcommittee member, that's how I feel about it. So.
Are you planning any redundancy, I don't know if that's the right term, any cross connections to allow for failed vehicles, like possibly on 4th Street, to shorten the loop if you had to get something back to the depot?
Not yet. The turnaround is desired to enable, it gives you better control over your operation, no question about it.
So the question was whether we'd have ability to turn cars around in the case of in the case of the Zeta, maybe you'd have a connection from eastbound 4th to southbound Robinson, and there's varying reasons why you have those connections. In this case, we'd be in the right lane connecting to a right lane, and so just so right of way may be a concern. But that's the sort of details we'll look at as we get into the detailed engineering.
Okay. Well, any other questions from the committee on this? Mark, Lee, and Rick, before we move on? Well, thank you, gentlemen. That was very thorough.
Thank you.
So we kind of bled into the next topic of just general discussion for the streetcar, but is there something else that, kind of off the topic of this presentation, but still on topics that we need to discuss today that you want to bring up?
Well, one thing that bothers me about this question that's going to be posed to the general public and stakeholders, how important is it to serve the existing downtown transit center, I think that's unfair without the context of the Nelson Nygaard study. I mean, from my conversation with the consultants and the presentation that was done at council and at these public meetings, they were strongly suggesting that simply overlapping major bus routes with whatever the chosen streetcar line is may be a sufficient connection that would warrant not necessarily having to go by the hub. I mean, I think that gives it, the way the question is worded or the fact that the question exists without any context of the bus system, I think is really unfortunate and unfairly weighs the scoring process.
Well, that's kind of what I meant about how much background information do you give these people who, I had all kinds of crazy ideas initially because I didn't know how these things worked, and I'm not sure how much valid information. People have a right to know what's going on, but they need to be given some background to make their comments worthwhile. And I'd say 99.9%, except for the people in this room, of probably the public, doesn't even know about the Nygaard study and the buses and the grid and the transit center and that whole thing.
I mean, Rick Kane has told me that the bus center is virtually at capacity right now. So if we build a bigger bus system, we're not necessarily, that facility is really in question. So I just, and then the same question would be, how many people on Auto Alley really want to go to Auto Alley? Because it seems like you've got the west side of downtown competing against the east side of downtown. And one is a scoring about a physical object, and the other is about what's the desire to go to the east side of downtown.
What you also have to be careful about, though, is making these questions too complex. As you just said, most people don't understand the operations. So if you wrote a paragraph and talked about couplets and and double tracking and all that, I think it would intimidate a lot of people. And these questions are meant to be just simple questions as it exists today. How important is it to have a direct connection to the park in phase 1?
Yeah, I'll
Well,
do it like I did my college exams, where I'll pick my answer, but then I'll explain it ad nauseum. So,
Yeah.
Well, and I think in the context of our consultants know that a bus routes interlooping between our route can serve the downtown transit center. I mean, they know that, so they have that lens to view the comments in.
I guess that was the question, how much weight
You
is this?
You mentioned integration, the Nelson Nygaard study. Where do we stand with the Nelson Nygaard study? Is that coming back to council? And what opportunities are there now that we're looking at these routes for better integration?
Rick, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I didn't hear all your question, Mark, but I'm assuming you're saying where are we?
Well, it was mentioned earlier the importance of integrating with the Nelson Nygaard study and looking at bus routes downtown and amplifying certain corridors and so forth, complementing what we've seen today. So where do we stand just in general with the Nelson Nygaard study? Is that coming back to council shortly, or is there opportunity for
No, at
some
this point in time,
refinement?
we expect to have a report before the end of the month, and we will see their recommendations. We know that there are going to be a few changes in their recommendations based on conversations that we've had and based on feedback that we got from the public during those public meeting sessions and input opportunities that they've had. So we will then take a look at those from a staff perspective, and given what they've said and add what we feel is important, then we'll move it forward. At that point in time, there's been no date set to go back to council. You know, any of these changes that we're considering making, because we're federally funded, we've got to go through a very specific federal process. It's going to take us several months to go through that. So there'll be a series of public meetings again that will be more localized in neighborhood areas as opposed to the one that we had, which was just down in the central downtown area as kind of a kickoff session. I'm anticipating that any recommendations that we take forward to council probably aren't going to happen until the latter part of this calendar year.
So will Nelson Nygaard now look at what's been discussed here
Nelson Nygaard's very aware of what's being discussed here.
and ensure that that's integrated?
Yeah. Now, I will say, based on some comments that I heard earlier in the presentation, Nelson Nygaard will tell you it's important to go to the transit center. That is they will tell you that is key. The second thing they will tell you is that we look to the streetcar to be a circulator so we don't have to run as many buses through the downtown area. Can we make connections without going to the transit center with bus routes? Yes, we can. But clearly their priority is to go to the transit center as we integrate with the bus system.
I did not know that. That is something that's new.
It's not new. They
Well-
they said it in their presentation.
Did they?
Yes.
Did they come out? Okay.
Missed that.
I missed it too.
Well, then it's not new.
It isn't.
Thank you. Is there anything else for Rick? Thank you, Rick. I had my own kind of comment for this agenda item too. I had heard that the Alliance for Economic Development, Kathy and some of her people have been talking about some kind of bid for operations or different financing options for operations. I don't want to put on the hook now because I wasn't on the item, but kind of directed to David. Is that something you can circle back and maybe we can learn about that this summer, next month?
Yeah, we're exploring those options, like you said, with the Alliance. We'll be bringing that in the future as we continue along on this.
So could you say a little bit more to that?
No, that's pretty much it.
But we'd like to invite somebody from that office perhaps to come and give
I think it would be very
few comments
interesting.
at the front. So if there's no other kind of comments from our subcommittee, I'd like to welcome our guests, and actually John Murray signed up to speak, so I think back here, so if you want to ask your questions.
Appreciate the opportunity. This has been quite informative. And I'm just a regular citizen, so carry no weight, but we all are.
So we are.
Yeah, exactly.
From just an observation, first time seeing it today, I've got a couple of questions about mainly the distance between, say, a north and southbound track. It looks like they're 100 feet away from each other. I mean, that's literally a block between the two. I mean, it looks very big up here.
About 300.
But essentially, my question would be, what is optimal as far as if you were in the center of the two lines, any of those lines, because they kind of are about the same distance between each other. I mean, what is optimal to walk? Why are they so close together, the north-south? I mean, why not go twice as far? It seems like you would serve more people with a little bit of walking rather than, I mean, so what if they're 300 feet? I mean, that's like literally a block away, or two, maybe two. And that would be one question. What is the optimal walking distance to a stop? The other is if you have the loop at Midtown, if you could, again, these look so large, but the largest loop there goes around a 2.5 block area. I mean, that's a lot of track to go. I mean, if you're standing where the old Mercy was, which is, what is that, Robinson? Okay, where is Walker?
This is Robinson.
That's Robinson, okay, so you have Walker is kind of dead center between Dewey.
That's from there, property.
Walker's a little bit farther.
It's a block east of Dewey is where the old hospital was.
Okay, so that's a larger loop. And what my question was about, this middle loop, I mean, that's literally around the block. It seems, again, very close proximity to, you know, without taking into consideration the, well, that is Robinson there, so I mean, it is a 3-block walk, but that's, again, that's a lot of track for, to me, a lot of track around one single area. Whereas the third tail track, I guess, again, from where Mercy was to that area, is that too far to walk? I kind of like that. And the other question was the single track up and if they're so close together, why not put them on the same road or have an up and down line, single line? Spread them apart if you're going to have that, if they're going to be that close. I guess it's, well, I would see it's better for an individual.
You want to answer that, Mark or Rick? As far as, so we have the spacing between like north and south, for instance, and kind of really it all revolves around what is too much or what is too little. It's
exactly, because you do have, there was a conversation between east and west side of the developing part of downtown. You got the brick town and then you've got Film Center, that area over there. And it seems that we're serving a central core north-south. And we kind of go east-west at certain intervals, but if the north-south was a little wider, couldn't the east-west go even further?
Well, you've challenged us to talk about all of transit planning, but hopefully we won't take that much time. Actually, the rule, which has been recently amended, was they really should be on the same street, going both directions. Because the transit rule is if you take transit one direction, you're going to take it back the other direction. And the other rule is, and you have to appreciate this is related to gravity, the theory of gravity, that people don't want to walk any distance. Okay, they want it right there. And the more distance you walk, the interest in doing it decreases by the square of the distance. Okay.
There's maybe a rule of thumb that says 2 or 3 blocks is about.
A quarter mile is traditionally regarded because a quarter mile takes 5 minutes to walk. And you can do a half mile, and so there are circles that they take around the transit locations, the stations, to describe what could be your demand. That was more of the traditional rules that people had thought about in building transit in the 70s and the 80s. It's modified quite a bit, and it has to do with some cities, and Portland was one of those, that chose to separate their lines like this and create what's called a couplet as opposed to having them on the same line. And it was found that the passenger is more complex than that simple model I just described to you. And the pleasantness of the walking, the nature of the attraction, all the other kinds of things make a difference. So you have the flexibility to separate them a little bit. Nobody has separated them a lot yet, as you're describing. There hasn't been that done. It's proposed in Los Angeles to create a wide circle in the downtown, only going in one direction, which you probably in 3 years will have a chance to learn whether that was a big success or a lot of complaints about it. But traditionally, the desire had been to provide for that transit trip in both directions, which is why they're in the same street. Moving them to one street apart, and these blocks were larger, making that separation. Very legitimate concern that this committee developed with regard to the nature of the experience for the passenger to choose to both return the way they came from. And so that's now, because we have so many different examples, we have to make more choices, right? Before, if you had just simple rules, you could just follow those rules and you didn't have all these things to agonize over. But the agony is actually enormously helpful. I think it enriches a project. Your questions raised, I was enthusiastic about hearing it because you do have the opportunity to experiment and prove some new things. And certainly the distance that you separate would has an impact. What I would tell you in Portland, and we had a very high level of development orientation, #1 priority. The streetcar being closely located to a development site made a huge difference in the developer's response, what they would build. Traditionally, we zone for much higher densities than we get. And on the streetcar line, before it was committed in 1997, we averaged 30% of the actual allowed density. And since 1997, the projects have averaged, when they're within 250 feet of a line, a single line or a double line doesn't make any difference. They average 90% of the allowed density. So there's a dramatic change. And when it's more than 250 feet away, they are averaging 75%. So it's still higher, but it's noticeably lower. And then at 500 feet, it's 60%. So there's definitely a difference in what density are built around the line.
Did that answer your question? And let me add to that. We had the same question when we first started up the subcommittee, and we got the same kind of explanation and answer. And as a novice, I became more and more aware and comfortable with that distance rather than thinking, why aren't we going up the east side of Oklahoma City and then all the way down the west? But,
well, I think that's either we make a loop or a line. It's that kind of simple, or a combination of both. But I don't know if I favor either one. But the explanation he's saying is when the density is a given, when the line is there. I mean, if they're on the same line, your density is going to be along that line and on that line alone. But if they are spread apart, you have more density if if you will, because you have further, you know, you're not here, you're there.
If I may, I mean, in general, with a couplet, you're still trying to create a legible line. So
I'm not saying miles, you know, but it looks very.
But in the context of Midtown and how it terminates, the analysis we will conduct and review and is, you can appreciate the differences here. If we have a stop here, well, who's going to walk to that? So we essentially look at that quarter-mile to half-mile influence zone. And so you imagine a circle of a capture area. Okay, so then you look at this route, and you would have that same capture area for that stop. And you know, I don't know how big that would be just at the moment. So if you had another stop on 13th, you would have a similar capture area. Well, that would overlap. And so where's the benefit of 13th? You're up into this neighborhood, which is primarily single residential. So are you touching or influencing, capturing that many more riders for this extra investment? We don't know. I mean, that's the analysis we'll do. So we haven't prejudged any option. This little compact loop, as well, is essentially, it's all just a terminus design. It's not capturing too much more. If you had a stop on the northern part, you might reach up here in the northeast a little bit better, but is that investment, you know, it's the bang for the buck.
I'd add to this a little bit more is keep in mind that all of the ridership's not as young as you and I and may not be able to hike that far either.
Our mayor often compares the loop, because that was discussed at length when we first started talking about streetcar, to the old monorail at the state fair. And if you have a giant loop, you essentially have an amusement ride if it's going in one direction. If you have the money and you can double track it and have the loop go the opposite direction, it's an efficient system. But if it's a single track, then it takes you twice as long to get back to the point where you first started.
Well,
That's a good analogy.
It sounds like I'm favoring a giant loop, and it's not. I really kind of like the drop-off tail track. And if that was extended to where you would go, say, into those zones, up into it and back, and then get on the larger loop, the city loop, like this or whatever you're calling the bottom part of the tail track. What if that was extended that one way and back on the same track, rather than the loop, which is, to me, limiting?
It's that, you know, configuration we will be looking at as far as how this is designed. Is your question, why not bring this a little bit further?
Right, I mean, you're putting in, say, in the middle, a pretty good amount of track there.
Yeah.
What if you just extended it one way up and back and then connected to your configuration towards the south?
It primarily, primarily it's that circle, getting through that circle. If we wanted to get through that circle, we would want to build a second track that did the little jog like I described before.
And something that we learned today is, you know, we were talking about what about double track on Broadway, and then what about just single track on Broadway, for example. Apparently single track, you don't actually hardly save any money, because then everything has to be synchronized, and you got to wait on that car to come back before anybody else can go. But as far as like, what about double track then? You know, you may recall that was something that we were asking about too. I mean, pushing for that, or asking about it. You know, have they considered it? And so that's still kind of ongoing too. Is it better to be, you know, double track on one street or a block apart? But as far as it being more than like a block apart, for instance, like a loop or a super coupler or something, my own kind of layperson interpretation is that if you're standing and you see one line going one way, but the other line going the other way is so far away you can't see it, then you'll just say, oh shucks, I'll just get a taxi. You know, you want to be able to see it going both ways. That way you know, okay, I got to go to dinner north, so I'll take that, and then all I got to do is go a block over, I see it and come back. So that's how I kind of conceptualize it myself too. But yeah, thanks for the question.
I just throw in a quick question, sneak it in. What would you say to the current buzz on social media as of right now, which is that there isn't a defined linear transit corridor to these routes?
You have to repeat the question.
Well, I see a lot of these routes, they're jogging around and jumping over here and jumping over there. And I mean, there's questions in the community already. Why not something straight, linear, seeing a very defined transit corridor?
You've struggled with it longer than we have. We are sympathetic to what you struggled with, trying to find a way to meet those important attractions. And the way they're configured in your existing environment, you can appreciate the straight, simple line is enormously difficult. Well, it's not only enormously difficult, but it cuts out certain attractions. So I think you offered a line that was similar to the Zeta option. And when we first thought about the Zeta, we thought that was an unusual line. But as we looked at its connections to the attractions, it started to make some sense. And just as even your own thoughts that you offered, which had an influence on our thinking about looking at something like that. And so we took that into consideration. But it is fundamentally related to how the downtown is organized and where the investments have been made, the locations that you're trying to serve.
Do we have any other questions from citizens, guests in the audience? Been a really good discussion. It's been one of our best. Go down in the history books. So we'll be continued certainly the next 1 or 2 meetings before we really know what we are dealing with. So
I move that we adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Can I say one thing? We have our first MAPS3 ribbon cutting, if you will. It's a lighting ceremony this Saturday night in the Boathouse District. If you're able to attend, it should be a great event.
Yeah, I forgot to ask if there's anything else from staff too, but that's it.
Well, and assume you're posting the public meeting as a meeting of the subcommittee and the board
for that,
for the public meeting.
Oh, but yes.
Yeah.
Santa Fe Station, any update, acquisition?
Still,
isn't there a court date shortly?
Excuse me.
Isn't there a court date?
There is. I can't remember that, but it is starting to wind up a little bit. Okay.
Councilman White, I have an apology to you. I said to you at the ACOG meeting that there'd be a presentation on the Adventure Line, and we lost one of our team members. A gentleman passed away, and apparently that's one big reason why they're not presenting today.
You want to try that again?
I move that we adjourn.
Second, those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign.
Jane, have